Hello and welcome to this Omron Tech Talk. During this video we'll see how to data log power consumption readings from an NJ or NX machine controller, in this example an NX102.1220, connected to a KMN2 power monitor. The data log values will be directly inserted by the NX102 into a table in the Microsoft SQL Server Express database installed on a PC. The data can then be viewed directly in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and also, more usefully, in visualization packages such as Power BI that connect to the database. The direct database connection features are supported by the CPU model shown and can connect to a variety of different databases. To set up an NJ or NX controller for database functions, make the DB connection settings in Sysmax Studio to specify the database type, database location, instance name, database name, and username and password for the NX102 to use. Then use the suite of database instructions for use in your ladder or structured text programs to insert, update and query data and execute stored procedures in the database. I will use some of these instructions in this video, specifically DB connect, DB create mapping and DB insert. Once the data is in the database, you can use other applications to present that data as reports, visualizations, etc. For example, with this video, I am using Power BI Desktop to read the data from the database and show live power and current readings in the form of time series column charts on a dashboard. And because the data is held in the database, you have historical records that can be saved for as long as you wish and easily searched, backed up and utilized in other applications. Firstly, a look at the NX102 project and the power consumption readings from the KMN2. Here's my NX102 project. If we look underneath the CAT section, there's the master, the controller itself, connected to a bus coupler. And on the bus coupler, I have an NX CIF105 communications unit. This is a 2-wire RS485 connection to the KMN2 power monitor. And in my programs, in this section here, I have this function block that's reading the KMN2 values into this variable in the NX102 called KMN2 readings. If I go online with the controller and show a watch window, we can see these values here. So the variables are structure. It's a collection of real values to bring in the voltages, currents, power factor frequency, and also a collection of unsigned double integers, which is the active energy in watt hours, kilowatt hours, and so on. So what we want to do is to take these values and log them to a database table. We'll look at that next. Some notes on installing a database instance, specifically with Microsoft SQL Server 2019 Express. When installing the database instance, choose New SQL Server Standalone Installation and specify a name for your SQL Server instance. You will need this name later. For authentication, make sure to select Mixed Mode, as the NJ and NX controllers don't support Windows authentication. Note that the install process also asks you to create a password for the System Administrator or SA account. You will need this later on, so remember the password you choose. After installation is complete, launch SQL Server Configuration Manager. For SQL Server 2019, this is in the folder shown, but check for your version of SQL Server. In the Configuration Manager, ensure TCP/IP is enabled to allow the NX102 to communicate with SQL Server. And in TCP/IP Properties, note the TCP port number. You may need to make a firewall rule to allow inbound traffic to that TCP port. In addition, when a named instance is used, on attempting to connect with the database, the NX102 will send a message to UDP port 1434. The SQL Server browser listens on that port and will respond back with SQL Server instance names and TCP port numbers. This data is then used by the NX102 to connect to the required SQL Server instance. For this reason, you may need to make a firewall rule to allow inbound traffic to UDP port 1434. Note with this example, I have two instances installed, SQL Express and SQL Express 2. For this video, I'll be using the SQL Express 2 instance. Now launch Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and log in with the System Administrator account to create the database and a login for the NX102 to use. So log into SQL Server Management Studio. So I can create a new database and we'll give it a name. And then we'll add a username for the NX102 to use. So we go into logins, make a new login. I'll just call this NX102 with SQL Server authentication. I'll just use a simple password for now. And then in user mapping, we map that user to the database. And then we specify what access we're going to give. I'm just going to be writing data to this database, so I'll just tick the DB data writer option. Switch to Sysmax Studio, and now we can make the database connection settings for the NX102. So we add a new connection. I could change the name if I wanted to. So the first thing we do is specify the database type. So I'm using SQL Server. Specify the IP address for where the server lives. So that's the IP address of my laptop with SQL Server installed. The instance name, SQL Express 2. The database name, and then the username and password. Okay, so I can go online with the controller and we'll send this configuration to the controller. So this is a blank project I'm using at the moment. We'll add some program a little later. And then I can click on the communication test button. So this will instruct the NX102 to try and connect to the database with the credentials we entered here. And test is OK, so we know we can connect. Next, we need to create a table in the database that matches the data structure of the KMN2 readings. I could do this by hand, referring to the data types reference table in the database connection CPU units manual. So the NX102 UDINT data type becomes a big int in SQL Server, and the real data type stays as a real in SQL Server. Another option is to use the DB service connection support tool to make this more quickly. I'll transfer my project to the NX102 that has the KMN2 readings variable declared. Then with the support tool I can read the structure of that variable to create a SQL query to create the table. So here's my Sysmax Studio project, and there's my KMN2 readings variable. So I'll go online with the controller and download the project. And now we can switch to the database support tool to read that structure of the variable. In the DB connection service support tool, I can click on online to go online with the controller. Go to the structure tab, and I can read from the controller all the structures currently in the NX102. There's the structure of our KMN2 readings variable. Click on that, and notice in this box it's created a SQL query, so we can copy and paste this into SQL Server Management Studio to create the table. So I click in the box, press Ctrl A to select all, right click and copy. In SQL Server Management Studio, click on the database name and click on New Query. Right click and paste, so it pastes in our SQL query. I'll change the table name. And then click on Execute. So command's completed successfully. I can close the query as we no longer need it. Just right click over tables here to refresh. And there's our table that's been created. I'll just go into design mode because I want to add a couple of extra columns to this. So the first one I'll call ID. This will be a unique identifying number for each record. And we'll make this a primary key. And in the identity property, double click, so it will add a value of 1 to every record that's created. And the next thing I want to do is to add a timestamp. And in the default binding, I'll use the getDate function, so every time a new record is created, it automatically puts in the date and time the record was created. And then I can close, save the changes, and that's complete. So back to Sysmax Studio, if I open my sample project, and just to recap, here's my DB connection settings. So there's my connection name, DB connection 01, with the settings we made previously, and we tested the link with this communications test button to make sure that worked. Then in my program I have a section here, and in this section we basically use 3 instructions. The first is DB connect, so this connects the controller to the connection name that we defined here. The next instruction to use is DB create mapping. This maps the variable in the NX102 with the table that we created in SQL Server, the table called energy readings. If I hop back to MSSMS quickly, you can see the table name there, energy readings. We don't use the DBO schema prefix that SQL Server uses, we just use that table name. Back to Sysmax Studio, so with the create mapping we've made the link between the variable and the table name, and then the last thing we need to specify is what type of mapping is this. We're doing an insert, as we are inserting data into a table. If it was a query or an update, we'd use a different string, but we use this SQL type insert here. The last instruction we use is DB insert. This actually inserts the data. So in this example, I pick up either a 1 second clock pulse or a 1 minute clock pulse, so I can log every minute or every second as I wish. And then the DB insert actually inserts the current values in this variable as a new record into the database table. So if I go online with the controller, and we'll send this project down, and go back into run mode, So the first thing we do when we are on, we have a status, a system flag here that says that the database engine is up and running. When it is, then we execute the DB connect. This is used here to execute the DB connect instruction. This bit of code here, if I get an error, if it doesn't connect, then it'll wait for a second and then retry. So this line ladder basically just keeps retrying the connection once a second until the connection's made. Once the connection has been made, we execute the create mapping instruction. Once that's done, then we're here. Check the comms with the KMN2 is up, and then I just have one or two variables to set. So if I set the 1 second variable, we can see every second we're now logging the KMN2 readings variable into the database table. Now the NX102 is logging values into our database. Back in MSSMS, we can have a look at the data in the energy readings table. Easy way to do that is to make a view. So right click, new view, select the table we want to read from. I'll say I want to view all columns, and then if I right click over timestamp, I can sort in descending order so the most recent record appears at the top. Just resize this window down here. This is the results window. Right click, execute, and there's our value. So you can see there's the timestamp in descending. So the last record was at 17/19/56. If I right click again and re-execute the SQL, it's now 17/20/08. So we can refresh this whilst the NX102 is logging. Lastly, I'll save this view. Refresh the views window, and there's our view ready to run whenever we wish. As well as using views in MSSMS to view the data, we can use other applications. So here I'm using Power BI Desktop. So let's create a dashboard showing us the energy readings in Power BI. So I want to get the data from SQL Server. So we type in the server name. So this is my PC name and the instance name for the SQL Server instance. And then I tick the direct query radio button, so this will allow the dashboard to run live without me having to press a refresh button. So we've connected to the database, and there's the database, and there's the table, and there's the view. So I'll select the view and load that. Okay, so there's our list of fields from the view. So let's make a cluster chart. We'll just click on the button and I'll just resize that. Now we can start adding the fields in. So I want timestamp on the x-axis, and then I want to take the active power on the values. Click on the paint roller icon and we'll just format this a little. So on the x-axis I'll change the text size to something a bit bigger, and then we can give the axis a title, and again change the text size, and then we'll do the same for the y-axis. Okay, we'll also enable the zoom slider so we can zoom in and out. Then we click on the background to the page, click on Paint Roller to enable page refreshing. And then we want to refresh this. I'll make it every second just so we can see something changing. And then we can add a filter. So this is showing all the records from the database. So if I click back onto the cluster chart, so we can filter on timestamp. So we'll have a relative time. So we'll show all records from the last hour. We can apply that and then lock. So it's just showing us an hour's worth of readings. So I'll copy that visual and then paste it. Just drag that down to there, and then I want to change this chart to show current. So I pick up current, drop it onto values, and remove the active power. And then from the paint roller, our y-axis has changed. So we just change the title. And then we can collapse the filter visualization in fields. And there's our values. So I've got a bit of current changing here. So if I zoom in on the power axis, or sorry, on the time axis for the power. So I've got a small servo connected to my demo case, so I can just change the power. So you can see the current there. Of course, that's on a different time scale. And if I wanted to zoom in, I just grab the slider and we can zoom in on current as well. And then we can zoom in right down and show every single change. Thank you for watching. I hope you found that useful.